Okay, we're officially beginning now with our first recording of a webinar for week one of 2301, EDSP 2301. So there have been a few issues with the textbook, and I think the primary issue is that the the professor who was slated to teach this class originally, I believe, was Mrs. Baumgardner, Donna Baumgardner, I believe. And she uses a different text than me. I've taught this class every year since 2012, and I have used a couple of different editions of this exceptional students book, and I like this book a whole lot. Mrs. Baumgardner prefers a different text, and so she has the bookstore order that one for her, and the bookstore usually orders this one for me. But I don't think the bookstore understood about who all was teaching this course this semester. I don't think I was actually scheduled to teach it until the last minute, and so they didn't get the memo over there, and so there's been some confusion about the textbook. So I apologize to any of you that had to make a switch with the book, or who are having a hard time getting the book here at the last minute. The ebook is really convenient if you are okay with using an ebook. I like the ebook. I've purchased the ebook that goes along with each of my classes if there is one available, because I like the convenience of having it on my iPad or my phone, and then it's with me, wherever I go. I don't have to lug that heavy thing around. It's always cheaper, and then it's it's just super convenient. You can highlight with with the functionality of the iPad or the phone, whatever you're using. And I really like it. But there's people waiting to be let in. I didn't have a waiting room set up, so I don't even know where they would be waiting to be let in.
Dakota said that it's waiting for her to be let in, and it says that she's the host.
It says that she's the host. How can that be? Well, that's just too weird. How can she be the host? Okay, let me see what I can do. Just a sec. How could she be the host? I didn't set up a waiting room. I did set up a how did y'all get to the meeting? Did y'all get to the meeting from Canvas?
I did.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I did too. Like as soon as you click it, it'll just load another window and it just pops up. And then you just connect the audio and stuff.
Right. So, and there's not a waiting room. Well, I don't know where they could be in cyberspace. So Dakota, did she send you a message? I can't hear you now, Jake.
Yeah, she sent us a message.
Well, tell her to go back to the Canvas page.
Okay, I will.
Do you mind? Thanks. I don't see how she can be the host.
I know, that was weird.
That makes no sense to me. I mean, I'm the host of the meeting. I don't get that. That makes no sense. Okay. Well, it's being recorded, and if anybody doesn't get to see it right now, they can watch it later. So we're not going to worry too much about that. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about the syllabus itself? I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the syllabus, but we'll go over the syllabus if anybody has any questions. And we can pull it up right now and look at it if anybody has any questions or comments about the syllabus itself. Anybody Want to talk about the syllabus? Expectations or assignments or anything like that? Our Zoom meetings will be every Tuesday night at 7. Assignments are always due on Sundays. All the assignments are listed there in the syllabus. Zooms are always on Tuesdays at 7. I'll post our discussion question for the week after our Zoom session. So if you don't tune into Zoom live any given week, watch the Zoom before you get on to do your discussion board, because it may be based on the textbook, but it may be based on something that's said in the Zoom session. So you do need to watch the Zoom session because there'll be information in the Zoom session that's as if you were in a face-to-face class. There'll be things that I talk about in the Zoom session. There'll be a PowerPoint presentation in the Zoom that I'll also post on Canvas that you can look at, that goes along with what's talked about in the Zoom session. So again, you don't have to watch the Zoom session live, but you will want to see it at some point because it's relevant to what's going to be part of the content of the class. So since so many people don't have a book yet, this week, I think I'll have our discussion board be relevant to what we talk about, what I talk about in this Zoom session. So you guys won't have to rewatch this in order to do your discussion board, because you will have already listened to it. So I think what I want to do right now then is share my screen and dive into this first chapter overview of our textbook. So stop me along the way if you have any questions. And if you haven't gotten your textbook yet, don't worry, because this is the content from that first chapter. When you get your book, you do want to read the chapter, because the chapter, the tests that we have are very closely linked to the textbook. And I go over the chapters in the PowerPoint presentations, and I'll do that each week during our webinar. But then like I say, the unit tests that we have, and we have 4 of those during the semester, those are very closely tied to the chapters in the book. So the first chapter talks about kind of an overview of special education in general. And some of you are planning to be special educators. Most of you are planning to be general education teachers. And some of you have things that you're wanting to do that aren't exactly education oriented, but that maybe have a link that's, a tangential kind of link. Maybe it's kinesiology or child and family studies or something along those lines. And maybe your career goals are a little bit different than the classroom. But most people that take this course are not planning to be special educators. And that's really what I expect. I'm a career special educator, but most of the people that I have come in contact with in my education career are not special educators. But everybody that's an educator deals with children who have disabilities. Every single person in a school system deals with children with disabilities or students with disabilities. And in fact, everybody in the world deals with individuals who have disabilities. You will come across individuals who have disabilities, and many of you I've seen in your discussion boards already as you introduced yourselves, have contact with individuals. It may be in your family, it may be in your friend circle, it may be you yourself who has a disability. And so we're going to talk about some of those kinds of things here at the beginning. So what exactly is a disability? Well, we have some verbiage here that we talk about throughout the course. And one of the words is impairment and one is disability. And an impairment and a disability are kind of interchangeable. An impairment means a loss of some sort. And a disability is also that same sort of thing. Now you'll hear people talk about special needs. My sister is special needs, or my brother is in a special needs class. And that usually just is synonymous with disability or special education when somebody says special needs. But that's not a legal term. It's not an official term. And so we don't really use that term in education. People use the term special needs usually in the wider world, but it's not a term that you'll see in education. So if you're going to be an educator, you need to begin to use the term disability, and you need to use the term special education, because those are the terms that we use in the school setting. Now, impairment is another term that is interchangeable with disability, and you'll see that in a few minutes when we get to the terminology that goes with each disability that's part of our legal terminology. But some people are offended by the word disability. And really, you shouldn't be, because it's simply a limitation and it's a reality that many people deal with. It's an impairment or a loss of some skill or ability that the general population has. And so we're going to talk about that. It's nothing that's a negative, it's just a reality. But we talk about the word handicap, and the word handicap is a negative. The word handicap is something that we try not to use. It's a word that has a very negative connotation. And so we don't use that word except in one connotation these days, and that would be when we talk about parking places. We talk about the handicap parking, and we haven't gotten away from that. We don't call that disability parking for some reason, but we still use the word handicap when we talk about parking places. But usually when we use the word handicap, that's a word that we use when we talk about what the world imposes on someone who has a disability. So that's a negative thing that the world, we who may not have disabilities, impose on people who do have disabilities. So let's say that if on our campus we didn't have a ramp to get to one of our academic buildings, that would be a handicap that we impose on someone who needs to have a wheelchair ramp to get to that building. So we've imposed a handicap on that person by not making that building accessible. That's what a handicap is, something that non-disabled people impose upon people who do have disabilities. So we try not to use the word handicap, except in that one circumstance where we're talking about parking spaces. And for some reason, like I say, we haven't changed the use of that word. Now, the last bullet you see on this slide says person first language. And this is the type of usage that we like to use when we talk about people who have disabilities. We don't want to say that kid, we don't want to say that blind kid, or that that speech impaired child. We want to say the child first, or the person first, and then talk about their disability. So we would say the child with a speech impairment, or the individual with an intellectual disability, or something like that. The individual with a learning disability, the person with dyslexia, rather than saying that dyslexic kid in my class, or that wheelchair kid, or that Down syndrome boy. That's language that's very negatively received by people with disabilities, because it puts the disability first, and it says that's who you are before we recognize that you're even a person. And so we don't want to use the disability. We don't want to say the disability first. We want to say the person first. So that's why we call that person first language. Now in Texas, well, anywhere across the country, some things I'm going to talk about are Texas specific, and some things I'll talk about are more of a national, nationally recognized. But and this is a nationally recognized thing, but I'm going to talk about the way we phrase it in Texas. We have this two-pronged disability test. This is the way we say, does a person have a disability in accordance with the school tests for disability? And the first one is there the presence of a disability? Does the person actually have a disability? And secondly, for the purposes of school, does that disability adversely affect their educational performance so that they need specialized instruction? So if you think about it for a second, here's an example. Does the person have a visual impairment? Do they have limited vision? Well, I've got limited vision, okay? And it's getting worse all the time. So I have a disability with my eyesight, and maybe some of you do too. But does my visual impairment adversely affect my educational performance to the degree that I would need specialized instruction? Well, you might assume that it does not, because I'm able to wear glasses and they correct my vision such that I don't need any specialized instruction. My glasses fix things for me enough that I don't need anything extra, and my educational performance has not been impeded by my disability, my vision impairment. Does that make sense? So that's the two-pronged test. We've got some laws that have helped to guide us along the way as we've been formulating the way we think as a country about disabilities for a number of years now. The most recent one is the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. You've probably all heard of that. And that was passed in 1990. And that's a national law. It's not an education law. It's a law that applies to everybody in the public sector. Any entity that receives any federal funding has to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's the law that says that all public buildings have to be handicapped accessible. We've got to have equality in hiring. We can't discriminate against somebody because of a disability. And if you were to go to one of the academic buildings on campus in Stephenville or at the Fort Worth campus, if you went outside the door to any one of the academic rooms, you would find that there's a room number, and below the room number itself is there in Braille. And none of that was there until ADA was passed in 1990. And then all of the room numbers and a lot of other things around campus were amended to have Braille there. All of that is part of ADA. So we are leveling the playing field for people with disabilities and giving them an opportunity to have accessibility and an opportunity to access everything that we have on campus and in a lot of other public buildings, just as though they were a person without a disability. Now, the primary law that determines what we do in schools for children pre-K through 12 who have disabilities is the next one. And we'll talk about it a ton this semester. It's the guiding law for school-age children and young adults who have disabilities in the public school sector. And that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we abbreviate that IDEA, and we just call it IDEA or IDEA. 2004 is the most recent version of that law that we have. It's desperately in need of reauthorization or updating, but that law has been around in some form or fashion since 1975. Now, 1975 is the first time that any law was passed in our country that necessitated public education for students with disabilities. Now, I was in high school in 1975. And just think about that. Some of your parents were probably in school in 1975. If not, your grandparents certainly were. And in those days, it was not, prior to 1975, it was not a legal requirement in our nation to provide education to kids with disabilities at all. And so what do you think happened to kids who had disabilities back then, prior to 1975? Well, as you might imagine, if they had too much difficulty in school, they didn't go. They dropped out, didn't go to school. Kids that you all probably went to school with who had pretty significant disabilities, who, kids who maybe were in wheelchairs or needed maybe tube feeding at school, kids who can't talk, can't walk, need a really high level of assistance in a school setting. Those kids didn't go to school at all. Many of those kids were institutionalized back in the day. But the law that was passed in 1975, and that was the precursor to IDEA, said all kids, it doesn't matter the condition of their disability, all kids are entitled to a public education. And we're going to talk about that all semester, about the types of disabilities, the types of education that they're entitled to, and what you as general educators or perhaps special educators will need to do when you run across all types of disabilities in your classrooms. The next one you see here is Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, you may have heard of this one because some of you probably get accommodations under Section 504. If you were a student who had dyslexia or maybe ADD or ADHD as you were in school, you may have gotten accommodations under Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973. And this is a law that recognizes all kinds of disabilities, such as the ones that I just mentioned. But it also says that perhaps for some of those disabilities that don't rise to the level of needing some of the services that are provided under IDEA, we'll provide some accommodations. And that's a lower level of provision of services than we give with IDEA. And there's not as much burden of proof of disability that you have with IDEA. And we don't provide modification with Section 504. We just provide accommodation in school. And we'll talk about that a lot more as the semester goes on. So, oops, I skipped a couple of slides. Let's see. So, how many kids actually have disabilities across our nation? Well, the national average is actually about 13%. About 13% of the entire population of a school you can expect to have a disability. Now, that's all different kinds of disabilities, a huge array of disabilities. In Texas, though, strangely enough, our Texas Education Agency for a number of years set a target at 8.5% and told all of our school districts across the state that they needed to keep their numbers to about 8.5%. Well, school districts had a whole lot of difficulty doing that, as you might imagine, when the national average was considerably higher than that. if school districts didn't maintain that average of 8.5%, or just a little bit of wiggle room on either side of that, the Texas Education Agency would uh, issue a corrective, well, a shame on you to the district. And then the school district would have to write a corrective action plan and put some measures in place to correct things. And if they didn't correct them in a timely fashion, there would be sanctions by the Texas Education Agency. And that turns into a loss of funding from the Texas Education Agency. And nobody wants to lose funding in a public school district. So what happens is school districts then start trying to get creative with the way they arrive at that 8.5%. And what happens is sometimes students who need special education were getting left out of the special education numbers and services, or kids who didn't really need special ed were being included so that the numbers would get right where they needed to be. Until 2018, so just a few years ago, a couple of the large school districts in Texas, and depending upon where some of y'all are from, you may be from some of these larger school districts, the Houston ISD, the Dallas ISD, and I think the San Antonio ISD gathered together and said, this is not right. And they filed suit against the Texas Education Agency and said, there's a problem here. And we have students in our districts who are not getting the services that they need from special education because we're working too hard to satisfy this mandate from the Texas Education Agency. And that complaint went all the way up the chain and landed with the U.S. Department of Education. And they said, yeah, we see a problem too. And so they came down to Texas and looked at things and said, there's a real problem here. And it starts with the Texas Education Agency. So they said, shame on you to TEA. And then TEA changed their rule. Well, what happened then was all of the school districts started going back and trying to reassess the students that they hadn't assessed for the last number of years who might have had disabilities that they hadn't caught. So there's been a big shift in the way districts are addressing their special education populations just in the last 3 years since this big shift came between the U.S. Department of Ed and the Texas Education Agency. So special education in Texas right now is in a big fluctuation. So let's talk about the disability types. You probably think you know a number of them, but you probably are wrong on several fronts. So I want you to look at this list. And I've got all 13 embedded in this list, but I've got a lot of red herrings here too, a lot that are not actually disabilities in Texas. So I want you to look at that list for just a couple of minutes and see if you can pull out the 13 that are actually disabilities in Texas. And by the time this semester is over, you will know these 13 like the back of your hand. And you've probably seen a number of these terms before. But we're going to go through them here in a minute, and I'm going to tell you which ones are and which ones are not disabilities in Texas. And remember, there's only 13 that are. So just take a minute and see if you can pull out 13 that sound logical. I'll give you about one more minute. Anybody want to turn their mic on and give a stab to at least one of them? We'll see how many we get. Anybody?
Is it the cerebral palsy one that's in Texas?
Cerebral palsy is actually cerebral palsy is not one.
Really?
It sounds like it ought to be, but it actually falls under another category. It falls under the category, usually it falls under the category of orthopedic impairment. So if you see orthopedic impairment up there, that's where cerebral palsy would fall. So good shot. And who was that spoke up?
Me, Destiny.
Thank you. I can't see everybody's picture right now while I've got my screen. Anybody else?
What about Down syndrome?
Down syndrome actually is another one that sounds familiar, but it is not a standalone disability. It usually falls under an intellectual disability, but it's not one all by itself. Somebody else?
Autism?
Autism is one. So we've got one there, and then I've given you two others. So we've got autism, we've got orthopedic impairment, and we've got intellectual disability. Anybody else?
The deaf blind.
Deaf blind, very good. Deaf blind is a very rare disability because it's less than 0.5% of the population in our schools. But those are the students who are both deaf and blind, or have some deafness and blindness, enough of which that they need special services for both. So I think in my mind of the Helen Kellers of the world, of which there are very few. But those are the kiddos that fall into that category. Thank you. Anybody else?
Attention deficit disorder?
Attention deficit disorder falls under another category. So that's another one of those that throws us off. Attention deficit disorder falls under a very strange category called other health impairment, or OHI. And that category contains anything that is health related, anything that you would have to go see the doctor in order to get a diagnosis. So Tourette syndrome, ADD, ADHD, diabetes, any like a heart condition or asthma, anything like that would require a doctor's diagnosis and then would impact the student's educational performance, that would be other health impairment. Thank you. Anybody else?
What about Asperger's syndrome?
Asperger's syndrome actually falls under autism. It's a type of autism. And also under that category would be pervasive developmental disorder. The last one that you see there on your list is a type of autism. So Asperger's and PDD, or pervasive developmental disorder, all fall under that autism spectrum or that autism umbrella. Anybody else?
Would learning disability be considered one?
A learning disability is one. And sometimes we even call it a specific learning disability, and we put an S on the front. So a learning disability or a specific learning disability. Now, that's actually the most common disability that you'll see in schools. And so a learning disability we'll talk about a lot this semester, because again, it's the most common. About 52% of all kids with disabilities in public schools have a learning disability. So if you're planning to be a general education teacher, the vast majority of kids that you see in your classes who have a special education label will be students who have learning disabilities. Anybody else? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got 6 already. And that means we've got what, 7 to go?
Would intellectual disability be the one of them?
Yeah, intellectual disability is one. And that's students who have low IQ. So that's usually where Down syndrome is. And dyslexia can fall under a learning disability because it's an academic disability, and that's what a learning disability is. So if you have dyslexia, sometimes it falls under Section 504 if it's not severe enough to need special education, and sometimes it falls under a learning disability because it's an academic, it's a reading disability, and if it's severe enough, it falls under a learning disability. Okay, I mentioned one while ago about my eyesight. Anybody see that one?
Visual impairment?
A visual impairment. And that can be complete blindness, or it can be limited vision if it's enough to impact the student's educational performance. So there's another one that you might think of if that impacts the eyes.
Auditory impairment.
Auditory impairment, very good. And obviously that's going to be one that impacts the hearing. And it might be complete deafness, or it could be partial deafness. Now, the deaf community prefers the term deaf, and lately they are preferring the term hard of hearing. But that's not actually part of our legal terminology right now. So even though the deaf community is pushing for a change in terminology from auditory impairment to deaf or hard of hearing, that actually hasn't happened yet. So we're still calling it auditory impairment in Texas right now. So we've got 8. Let's see.
Would emotional disturbance? be
Emotional
one?
disturbance is one. Yes, it is. And that one is tough because it's invisible. We don't see that one at all, but it's depression falls under emotional disturbance. Sometimes kids who act out behaviorally, sometimes those are emotional disturbances as well. So we've got 4 to go. Let's see.
Would conduct disorder be one?
Actually, conduct disorder is not. It sometimes looks like an emotional disturbance, but conduct, and we'll talk about that more this semester when we talk about emotional disturbance, because it looks so much like an emotional disturbance that a lot of times teachers think that it is, and they make special ed referrals for a conduct disorder. But it's actually, there's a fine line there, and it's not actually emotional disturbance. If a child has the ability to control it in a way, there's a fine line there, and that's also the way oppositional defiant disorder is, and you'll see that on your list. Oppositional defiant behavior, that's not considered emotional disturbance either. And school psychologists help us make the determination in the difference there between emotional disturbance and those disorders that are considered more of a social behavioral issue.
So would at-risk and early childhood be an emotional disturbance? Or are they kind of similar in any way? Or in
Actually, not officially. At-risk kids are certainly ones that we want to keep our eyes on, and
Correct.
kids that are early childhood. Now there is an early childhood designation on the other side of the list.
Yes.
Non-categorical early childhood is a designation.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that more later in the semester, but that's what we call it in Texas. In other states, they call that developmental delay. But in Texas, we call it non-categorical early childhood, and it's for the kiddos who are 3 through 5. And we can serve those children in our preschool programs if they have the indication of certain disabilities. But it's kind of particular what we have to, all of boxes that we have to check in order to give a child special education services if they're 3 through 5. So now we're down to 3 more. Let's see. There's
Did
one
somebody
called,
already say
say again,
traumatic brain injury?
what'd you say?
Traumatic brain injury.
Traumatic brain injury. Yes, that's one. Very good. Traumatic brain injury. Some of you all may have had this other service when you were very young. A lot of young children have difficulty with their speech. Anybody have speech services when you were little? Speech impairment is another one. And the last one is a tough one. It's called multiple disabilities. And that's where we have several of these more severe disabilities that overlap, and the student needs services for several of them at the same time. So I'm going to go over the list again so you can jot these down, but we'll do this several times this semester so that you can have the official ones written down, and they'll be in your textbook as well. So we've got autism, orthopedic impairment, intellectual disability, deaf blind, other health impairment, learning disability, visual impairment, auditory impairment, emotional disturbance, non-categorical early childhood, traumatic brain injury, speech impairment, and multiple disabilities. So that's our 13. Did everybody get 13 like me? Okay, so the ones that happen a lot, that occur frequently, are called high incidence disabilities. And the ones that are infrequently occurring are called low incidence disabilities. So like the deaf blind, the one I said that like Helen Keller, the one that occurs infrequently would be a low incidence disability. And the learning disability that happens 52% of the time, that would be a high incidence disability. But sometimes those numbers fluctuate a little bit, or maybe they fluctuate widely. Why do you think that might be? Any ideas? Any ideas why those numbers might change? Why one category might grow or it might diminish over time? There's one particular category that has grown over the last few years. Any ideas what that one might be?
Is it autism?
It is autism. That's exactly right. Any ideas why autism might have grown? There's lots of different ideas as to why. One idea is that we're getting better at identifying it. That's one reason it might be more, why it might be on the rise. Some people think that there are things in the environment. I don't happen to believe that. I think we're getting better at identifying it. I also think that we are calling things autism that we used to call other things. And we'll talk a whole lot more about that when we get to the chapter on autism. Some of the more severe cases of autism we used to call childhood schizophrenia, but we don't call anybody a childhood schizophrenic anymore. We don't, that term has gone totally out of fashion, but we have a whole lot more kids that we call autistic. We used to also not recognize those kids that function at the very high end of the autism spectrum. Those kids were just nerds, you know. They were bookish, extra smart kids. They were the Sheldons from oh, help me with the name of the show. What's it called?
Big Bang Theory.
Big Bang Theory. Yeah. They were the Sheldons of the world. And they were the extra smart kids. And we sure didn't say they had a disability, but now we recognize that those kids are high functioning students with autism. And if you were to go to an engineering firm and walk around for a few minutes, a lot of the engineers that you run into would probably be considered individuals with autism or high functioning autism, Asperger's syndrome. But it's certainly not imposing itself as a disability on them. So that's one reason we have some fluctuation. We're better at identifying some disabilities. For some of our children with more significant disabilities, our medical services have improved. Children who generations ago would not have survived, premature births and things like that, do survive these days. And so we've got more children with some of those kinds of disabilities that a number of years ago would not have lived to see the school setting. Let's talk for just a second about what special ed and related services are. Well, special education is a service and it's not a place. So you need to start shifting thinking from special ed is a room down the hall to it's a service. A lot of special education these days happens in the general ed setting rather than in a special room down the hall. Special ed is also a continuum. It's a lot of different services and a lot of different places. It may be in the general education classroom where the general ed teacher gives some assistance to the child at the direction of a special educator. It may be a special educator coming into the general ed classroom. It may be the student going out to a special ed classroom for a little while and then coming back in. It may be a lot of time spent in a special ed classroom. It may be a special school. It's a lot of different things. Or it may be some special service people coming into the school and helping, maybe a physical therapist or a speech pathologist or an occupational therapist or a music therapist or lots of other things, people with specialized services that come into the school setting and work with the student. So special education is more than just a separate room down the hall where kids go and are separated from their general education peers. Those are all the things that we're going to talk about this semester. So that is the first bit of the chapter. I'm going to talk for a few more minutes about the second part of the chapter. So give me just a minute to switch over to this other part of the chapter. And we'll go over this for a minute and then we'll be done. So the second part of that first chapter gives a little bit of history of special education. And oops, can y'all see that? Can y'all see the PowerPoint I have up right now?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
No.
I don't think I shared it correctly. Let me. Oh, I closed it. Just a second.